Well, we're reading this week in John 13, and a familiar story front and center here.
That's right.
With Jesus washing his apostles' feet. The thing I love about this story is, after this, you never read about them having an argument about who was the greatest.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's right.
And you just wonder, after God washes your feet, does that sort of change you forever?
Yeah.
And so I think this is a really, really dramatic scene. You chose the readings for this year.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about why, in the context of zealous for good works, you wanted us to read John 13 this week.
Well, the chapter as a whole is fascinating. You're right. I mean, part of the highlight for our purposes is the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, and how that obviously embodies a servant mentality, that we are to do good things. And Jesus will make clear, if I've done for you, you've got to do this for each other. And so part of being Christ-like is this serving each other. But before the chapter's over, then you do have in verses 31 to 34, this new commandment I give you, to love one another. And by this all will know that you are my disciples, by the love you have for one another. And around that then is kind of sandwiched, seesawing between the two great failures of the disciples that night, which is Judas's betrayal and Peter's denial. And so you have human failure to do good deeds, even when warned, in the face of one of Jesus. Of course, the crucifixion is itself the greatest of his loving deeds, but the humiliation of doing a slave's job and washing feet, and then saying, "This is you have no part of me if you don't embrace this kind of a mentality."
Nasty job.
Oh, it was a slave's job.
Yeah, reserved for the lowliest slave in the house.
That's right.
And so
that's right.
One of the interesting things about the story is they're reclining when Jesus does this.
Yes. Yeah.
So evidently, first, no slave was provided, which now makes me suspicious. If this isn't
Jesus setting this up,
setting this up. Yeah. Well, they needed this lesson.
Sure.
And then secondly, none of the 12 stepped up to do the job.
Yep. And are almost embarrassed. At least Peter seems to be almost embarrassed when Jesus does.
Well, yeah. At least he was smart enough to get that of everyone in the room, Jesus certainly shouldn't be the one
doing this.
That was washing the feet. That's exactly right. So to knit this back into what we've been saying about zealous for good works. So often the works we're called to do are works of service.
Yeah.
We're called to be servants.
Right.
And I think this story exposes one of the greatest obstacles to servanthood.
Right.
There's an interesting statement that Jesus makes. Look at verse 13 after he washes their feet. In fact, verse 12 ends with a question. Do you know what I've done to you?
Right.
That's rhetorical.
Yeah.
Because the answer is
no.
We don't have a clue what you've been doing.
The enormity of what's just happened.
But he says this, and this is odd. You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, wash your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you should also do as I did to you. And so I think the reason Jesus is able to do this is because he understood that this act of humble service, eclipsed only by the cross, this act of humble service in no way diminished who he was.
That's right.
He knew who he was, so he could wash feet. I think one of the reasons that we don't serve, at least serve in some ways, is because we don't know who we are.
Yeah.
We lack the humble servant's heart, and we try to protect status. And so I remember one time we had an older guy in a church that I was working with that refused to come to a work day at the building. And his attitude was, can't we just hire someone to clean up around here?
Right.
Here is a wealthy guy who didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
He had to protect that status, which prevented him from cleaning toilets. When you know who you are, it releases you to serve.
That's right. And to that point, Dave, I think it's even interesting then back up in verse 3, where to your point, right before he washes their feet, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he had come from God, was going back to God, rose from the supper. Jesus does this in one sense, knowing that he's deity, and where he's ironically after this night and this death and the resurrection, where he's headed back to. And once it's almost like the text is trying to tell us this is part of the revelation of who he is. Knowing who he is means I need to do this.
Right.
And again, then bring it down to where you're talking to us about as well. Verse 16, therefore, if a servant's not greater than his master, who are we not become these kind of people?
Well, and before we cut this short, maybe we need to comment on who we are, and that is who all of us are lost sinners, desperate to be rescued. And in that way, all of humanity is in the same boat. In that way that matters most, all of humanity is in the same boat. I'm not better than anybody else, no matter what I drive, where I live, what my bank account numbers look like. In the way that matters, we are all exactly the same. And I think when we get that, it enables us to be a humble servant.
Humility is the mark of self-awareness.
There it is. So ponder that this week, and ponder the connection to the good works that we ought to do, that maybe our pride, our failure to understand who we are, is getting in the way of what we need to do.
Yeah.